The crystal chandeliers of Ashmont House cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table, where 12 of London's most distinguished guests sat frozen in horror, their champagne glasses suspended mid-air, their breath caught in collective shock as they witnessed something that would be whispered about in drawing rooms for decades to come. A man dressed in servant's livery had lunged across the table with a gleaming dagger aimed directly at the heart of Sebastian Thornfield, Duke of Ashmont, the most powerful and feared nobleman in all of England. But before any of the guards stationed at the doors could move, before any of the titled gentlemen could rise from their velvet chairs, a blur of dark fabric shot forward from the shadows near the sideboard. Isabel Hartley, the governess whom none of these aristocrats had bothered to acknowledge, moved with the deadly precision of a street fighter, her hand snatching a silver dinner knife from the table as she twisted her body between the Duke and his attacker. The sound of metal against metal rang through the dining hall as she deflected the assassin's blade. Then in one fluid motion, she drove her knee into his stomach and pressed the edge of her impromptu weapon against his throat, forcing him to the marble floor with a strength that seemed impossible for a woman of her slight frame. The room erupted into chaos, ladies screaming, men shouting for guards, but through it all, Sebastian Thornfield remained utterly still, his dark eyes fixed not on the would-be killer pinned beneath his governess, but on the woman herself, on Isabel Hartley, whom he had barely noticed in the 3 months she had worked in his household, and who had just saved his life with skills no ordinary governess should possess. The Duke of Ashmont was not a man easily surprised, yet as he stared at the woman who still held the assassin, immobilized with ruthless efficiency, Sebastian felt something crack in the ice that had encased his heart for the past 2 years, ever since the night his wife Genevieve had died under circumstances that still haunted his nightmares and made him trust no one. He had hired Miss Hartley through an agency, barely glancing at her references, caring only that she could teach his orphaned niece, little Catherine, the skills a young lady of quality required. Isabel had been a ghost in his house, a figure in grey wool who kept to the nursery wing, who curtsied silently when he passed in the corridors, whose face he could hardly remember despite seeing her nearly every day. She was meant to be invisible, forgettable, merely another servant in a household of 50, yet here she stood, breathing hard. A strand of dark hair escaped from her severe bun, her hazel eyes blazing with an intensity that transformed her plain features into something almost fierce, almost beautiful. Sebastian watched as his guards finally reached them, pulling the assassin away, binding his hands, but his attention never left Isabel as she straightened her simple grey dress, as she smoothed that errant strand of hair back into place, as she transformed once again into the demure, unremarkable governess, her eyes downcast, her hands clasped before her, as though she had not just executed a move that would have impressed the most seasoned. So, Falger in His Majesty's army. The guests were ushered out, their evening of fine dining abandoned, their minds already racing with the scandal they would share at tomorrow's morning calls. But Sebastian dismissed them all from his thoughts as he finally spoke directly to his governess for perhaps the first time since her employment began. He asked her to remain, to come to his study, and though his voice was calm, controlled as always, inside his chest his heart hammered with questions that demanded answers. Who was this woman? Where had she learned to fight like a trained assassin? What secrets lay behind those carefully lowered eyes? As Isabel followed him through the corridors of Ashmont House, her footsteps silent on the Persian runners, Sebastian felt the foundations of his carefully ordered world beginning to shift, felt the walls he had built around himself starting to tremble, though he did not yet understand that this moment, this night, would change everything he thought he knew about trust, about worth, about the possibility of loving again. But before we discover what truths would be revealed in that study, before we understand how a duke and a governess could bridge the impossible chasm between their worlds, we must travel back 3 months, to a cold morning in November, when Isabel Hartley first climbed the steps of Ashmont House, carrying a battered carpet bag and a heart full of desperate hope, never imagining that accepting this position would lead her from the shadows of Sir. Fitued into the brilliant, dangerous light of a love that would shock all of London society. Before I continue with the next section, I want to thank you so much for being here with me today. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. Your support means the world and helps me bring you more captivating historical romances like this one. Now let us return to Isabel's story, to the beginning of a journey that would transform both her life and the heart of the coldest duke in England. Sebastian Thornfield had not wanted a new governess, had not wanted anyone new in his household at all, but his sister-in-law, the Dowager Duchess, had insisted that young Catherine needed proper instruction, and he had learned that arguing with the formidable woman was an exercise in futility. So when the agency sent Miss Isabel Hartley, he had granted her the briefest of interviews in his study, noting only that she was young, perhaps 25, with an unremarkable face, a quiet voice, and references that seemed adequate though not impressive. She had no family, the agency informed him, no connections, having lost her parents to fever and her only sister to circumstances the agency delicately declined to specify. She was alone in the world, desperate for respectable employment, and she would be grateful for the position and the safety of his household. Sebastian had hired her with barely a second thought, another invisible servant to join the staff, someone to fade into the background of his life just as he preferred. For in the 2 years since Genevieve's death, he had wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his grief, his guilt, and the growing paranoia that perhaps his wife's fall down the stairs had not been the accident everyone claimed it was. Isabel had arrived at Ashmont House with nothing but the clothes on her back, a single spare dress folded carefully in her worn carpet bag, and the weight of secrets she could never share pressing heavy against her chest like stones. The grand estate rose before her like a fortress of grey stone and leaded windows, its towers piercing the November fog, its gardens stretching in manicured perfection toward distant woods, and she had stood at the servants' entrance, feeling the familiar grip of fear that had accompanied her through every threshold she had crossed since her sister Mary's death 6 months earlier. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crawford, a stern woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, had led her through the maze of servants' corridors to the nursery wing on the 3rd floor, explaining in clipped tones that the Duke rarely ventured to this part of the house, that Miss Catherine was a sweet child but prone to melancholy, since losing her parents to a carriage accident the previous year, and that the previous 3 governesses had all left within months. Unable to reach the grieving girl or tolerate the oppressive atmosphere of a household where the master himself was drowning in sorrow. Isabel had listened, nodded, said little as she always did, keeping her thoughts locked safely behind the mask of quiet competence she had perfected during her years of survival, the years when she and Mary had lived in the shadows of London's East End, where a young woman's only protection was her ability to remain unnoticed, unremarkable, and utterly forgettable. The truth that Isabel carried like a hidden dagger was this: she had not always been poor, had not always been nameless and alone. Her father, Thomas Hartley, had once been a prosperous merchant with a fine house in a respectable quarter of London, and Isabel had grown up with music lessons, beautiful dresses, and the expectation of a good marriage to a gentleman of her own class. But when she was 17, her father's business partner had betrayed him, embezzling funds and leaving Thomas Hartley bankrupt and broken. Within a year, both her parents had succumbed to a fever born of poverty and despair, and Isabel and her younger sister Mary had found themselves cast into the streets with nothing. No relatives willing to claim them, no inheritance to sustain them, only each other and the fierce determination to survive. For 3 years they had lived in a boarding house in Whitechapel, Isabel taking whatever respectable work she could find, sewing, mending, cleaning, while Mary, beautiful sweet Mary, had grown increasingly fragile, increasingly desperate, until one terrible night she had accepted the wrong man's offer of protection and paid for that choice with her life in an alley Isabel still could not pass without feeling her heart shatter anew. It was in those years of survival, in those dark streets where death lurked in every shadow, that Isabel had learned to fight. An old soldier who lived in their boarding house, a man named Thomas Shaw, who had lost his leg at Waterloo and his mind to the horrors he had witnessed, had taken pity on the 2 young women and taught Isabel the brutal, efficient combat techniques he had learned in the army. He had shown her how to move, where to strike, how to use anything as a weapon, how to turn an attacker's strength against him, and most importantly, how to act without hesitation when violence came calling. Isabel had practiced in secret, in the alley behind the boarding house in the early mornings before the city woke, her body learning the deadly choreography even as her heart prayed she would never need to use it. But she had needed it, more than once fighting off men who thought two women alone were easy prey. And when Mary died, when Isabel had been unable to save her sister despite all her training, all her preparation, she had vowed to bury that past completely, to transform herself into the perfect picture of respectable mediocrity, to become a governess who would never draw attention, never invite questions, never give anyone reason to look to see, loosely at the scars her former life had left upon her soul. So when she met young Catherine Thornfield, a solemn child of 7 with her uncle's dark eyes, and a sadness that seemed too large for her small frame, Isabel had poured all her damaged heart into reaching the girl, into teaching her not just French and watercolors and proper posture, but into showing her through quiet example that loss did not have to define you, that strength could be found even in sorrow. The Duke himself remained a distant figure, a tall man in black who passed through corridors like a shadow, who rarely spoke to his staff, whose reputation as a cold and heartless aristocrat was whispered about below stairs with a mixture of fear and pity. The servants gossiped endlessly about the late Duchess Genevieve, about her mysterious fall, about the Duke's grief that had transformed him from a charming young nobleman into this isolated, suspicious man who trusted no one and seemed determined to feel nothing. Isabel had listened to these stories but kept her distance, focusing entirely on Catherine, on creating a small sanctuary of safety and learning in the nursery wing, never imagining that she would remain invisible to the Duke only until the moment when staying invisible became impossible. For 3 months Isabel had lived this quiet existence, teaching Catherine, taking meals in the nursery, walking in the gardens only in early morning when the family would not see her, and slowly, painfully, she had begun to feel something she had not felt since her father's business collapsed, the faint, fragile possibility of peace. But peace, as Isabel had learned long ago, was never permanent for women like her, for women without protection or position or power. And on that November evening when the Duke hosted his first dinner party since his wife's death, when Mrs. Crawford had asked her to supervise the arrangement of the dessert service in the dining room, Isabel had walked into that glittering space, never suspecting that within minutes her carefully constructed invisibility would shatter, and the Duke of Ashmont would finally truly see her for the first time. The days following the assassination attempt transformed Isabel's existence at Ashmont House in ways both terrifying and intoxicating, for the Duke, who had never acknowledged her presence, now seemed unable to look anywhere else. Sebastian had questioned her that night in his study, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made her throat dry, asking where she had learned to fight, demanding to know who she truly was, and Isabel had made the desperate choice to tell him a carefully edited version of the truth. She spoke of her father's bankruptcy, of the years in Whitechapel, of the soldier who had taught her to defend herself, but she said nothing of Mary, nothing of the guilt that still woke her screaming in the night, nothing of the darkness that lived inside her, where love and loss had carved out a hollow space. Sebastian had listened without interruption, his aristocratic face unreadable, and when she finished he had done something that shocked her more than his questions. He had thanked her, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name, and told her that she had saved not just his life but the life of his household, for Catherine would have been orphaned completely if the assassin had succeeded, and he would be forever in her debt. But gratitude, Isabel soon discovered, was a complicated gift from a man like Sebastian Thornfield. He began summoning her to his study each evening after Catherine was asleep, ostensibly to discuss his niece's progress and education, but the conversations quickly drifted into territories far more personal and dangerous. He asked about her opinions on books, on politics, on the state of London's poor, and he actually listened to her answers with a focus that made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced since her father's death. Sebastian shared pieces of his own story in turn, speaking haltingly of his marriage to Genevieve, a union arranged by their families when both were barely 20, how they had been cordial strangers who shared a house but never truly shared their hearts, and how her death on the stairs had left him drowning in guilt and suspicion, convinced that someone in his own household had pushed her, but unable to prove it. unable to trust anyone around for Isabel found herself drawn into his pain, understanding it in ways he could not possibly know. And night after night, she returned to her small room in the servants' quarters, feeling as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that falling would destroy her but unable to step back from the edge. The household staff noticed the change immediately, their whispers following Isabel through the corridors like invisible chains. The other servants, who had treated her with polite indifference before, now regarded her with suspicion and resentment, for it was unnatural, they muttered, for the Duke to spend so much time with a governess, to seek her company, to look at her with an expression they had never seen on his grief-hardened face. Mrs. Crawford warned her quietly one morning that she was treading dangerous ground, that dukes did not marry governesses no matter how much they might admire them, and that if Isabel valued her reputation and her position, she would do well to remember her place. The words stung because they were true, because Isabel knew with painful clarity that whatever was growing between her and Sebastian existed in a space outside the rigid laws of society, a space that could not survive exposure to the harsh light of reality. She was nothing, nobody, a woman with no family, no fortune, no name worth claiming, and he was one of the most powerful men in England, with responsibilities to his title, his estates, and the aristocratic world that would never accept her as anything more than a servant who had forgotten her station. Yet despite her fears, despite the warnings, Isabel could not stop the transformation happening in her own treacherous heart. She found herself watching for Sebastian during the day, her pulse quickening when she heard his footsteps in the corridor, her skin warming when his hand accidentally brushed hers as they bent over Catherine's schoolwork together, for he had begun joining their lessons in the nursery, claiming he wished to know his niece better but spending as much time looking at Isabel as he did at the child. Catherine bloomed under their combined attention, the sadness lifting from her small face as she witnessed the uncle she barely knew laughing at Isabel's stories, debating history with her governess as though her opinions mattered, treating Miss Hartley not as a servant, but as an equal. The little girl began asking innocent questions that pierced Isabel's heart like arrows. Did Miss Hartley think Uncle Sebastian smiled more now? Did she believe he was finally happy again? Would Miss Hartley stay with them forever, because Catherine could not bear to lose another person she loved? Forever was a word that had no meaning for women in Isabel's position. But as November turned to December, and the first snow fell over Ashmont House, she allowed herself the dangerous luxury of imagining it, of picturing a future where she belonged not in the servants' quarters, but beside Sebastian, where her past did not matter, and her lack of title or fortune was irrelevant compared to what they had discovered in those quiet evening conversae. Tyhans. She knew she was being a fool, knew that fairy tales did not come true for penniless governesses, but when Sebastian looked at her with those dark eyes full of longing and confusion and something that looked terrifyingly like hope, Isabel could not stop herself from falling, could not prevent her guarded heart from opening to the impossible, beautiful dream of being loved by a man who was supposed to be forever beyond her reach. The night everything changed arrived with a winter storm that battered the windows of Ashmont House and trapped the household inside with their secrets and unspoken truths. Sebastian had been investigating the assassination attempt with grim determination, hiring investigators, questioning servants, following threads of conspiracy that led into the darker corners of London society, and what he had discovered filled him with a rage so cold it frightened even himself. His own cousin, Lord Edmund Thornfield, who stood to inherit the dukedom if Sebastian died without an heir, had hired the assassin, motivated by gambling debts so massive that only the duchy's fortune could save him from ruin. The Bow Street runners had arrested Edmund that morning, dragging him from his club in chains, while half of London's aristocracy watched in scandalized horror. And Sebastian had returned to Ashmont House feeling hollowed out by the betrayal, by the confirmation that his paranoia had been justified, that someone within his own family had wanted him dead and had been willing to kill him in his own home. He had gone directly to his study and opened a bottle of brandy, drinking alone in the darkness. But when the storm began and the house settled into night, he found his feet carrying him not to his empty bedchamber, but up the stairs to the third floor, to the door of Isabel's small room, because she was the only person in this vast house who made him feel anything other than suspicious and alone. Isabel opened the door in her nightdress and wrapper, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen, and the sight of her like this, unguarded and soft in the candlelight, nearly broke his carefully maintained control. He should not have come, should not be standing in the doorway of her room in the middle of the night, but the words spilled from him anyway, jagged and raw, telling her about Edmund's arrest, about the years of suspecting everyone around him, about how Genevieve's death had made him believe that love and trust were luxuries he could no longer afford because they made a man vulnerable, and vulnerability was deadly. Isabel listened as she always did, her hazel eyes full of understanding and compassion, and then she did something that shattered the last of his defenses. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and strong as they wrapped around his, and she told him that he was not alone anymore, that she understood what it meant to survive when the world wanted you dead, and that the walls he had built around his heart did not make him strong. Hay only made him a prisoner, in a cell of his own construction. Sebastian felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen and dead for 2 years suddenly flooding back to painful, terrifying life. He pulled Isabel into his arms without thinking, without caring about propriety or consequences, and she came willingly, her body fitting against his as though she had been made to rest there, her face buried in his shoulder as his hand tangled in her loose hair. They stood like that for a long moment, two broken people clinging to each other in the darkness, and Sebastian realized with a clarity that stole his breath that he had fallen in love with this woman, this governess who was supposed to be invisible and forgettable, but who had become the only real thing in his hollow existence. He loved her courage, her strength, the way she listened to his fears without judgment, the way she had transformed Catherine from a sad ghost of a child into a girl who laughed and asked questions and believed the world might be good again. He loved the contradiction of her, the deadly fighter hidden inside the quiet governess, the brilliant mind concealed behind downcast eyes, the passionate heart beating beneath her prison of propriety. When Sebastian finally found the words, when he pulled back just enough to look into Isabel's face and tell her that he loved her, that he wanted her not as his employee or his secret, but as his wife, as his duchess, as the woman who would stand beside him for the rest of his life, he watched her expression transform from joy to anguish in the space of a heartbeat. She stepped back from his embrace, wrapping her arms around herself as though she needed to physically hold herself together, and she told him what he already knew but had been trying to ignore. That society would never accept their marriage, that a duke could not wed a governess without family or fortune or name, that his peers would mock him and ostracize them both, and most painfully, that she could not bear to be the cause of his ruin, could not watch him sacrifice his position and reputation for a woman the world considered worthless. Her voice broke on the last word, and Sebastian saw the truth written in her tears. Isabel believed she was not worthy of him, that her past and her poverty made her undeserving of love, and that conviction was the cage that imprisoned her far more securely than any concern about society's judgment. Sebastian Thornfield had been raised to care deeply about duty and reputation and the weight of his ancient title. But in that moment, standing in Isabel's small room, with the storm raging outside, and his heart finally painfully alive again, he made a decision that would have scandalized his ancestors and shocked every member of the Tourne. He told Isabel that he did not care what society thought, that she had more honor and nobility in her smallest finger than most titled ladies possessed in their entire beings, and that he would not let her past or her fear or the narrow-minded prejudices of the aristocracy steal their chance at happiness. He would marry her, he declared, and he would do it publicly, proudly, in a way that left no doubt about his feelings or his choice, and if London society wanted to whisper and judge and turn their backs, then let them, because he had spent 2 years living in darkness and isolation, and he refused to spend another day in that prison when the woman he loved was standing right in front of him, offering him the possibility of light. Isabel wanted to believe him, wanted to surrender to the fierce certainty in Sebastian's voice and the love burning in his dark eyes, but years of loss and survival had taught her that wanting something desperately did not make it possible, and that hope was often the cruelest form of self-deception. She asked him to leave her room that night, not because she did not love him, but because she loved him too much to let him make a decision in the heat of emotion that he might regret when the cold light of morning revealed the true cost of his choice. Sebastian had reluctantly agreed, but not before extracting a promise from her, that she would not run, would not disappear into the night, as he suspected she might be tempted to do, and that she would give him the chance to prove that his feelings were not a temporary madness but a permanent truth. Isabel had given her word, and so she remained at Ashmont House through the difficult days that followed, even as the scandal of Lord Edmund's arrest spread through London like wildfire, and the Duke of Ashmont's household became the subject of intense scrutiny and endless speculation from a society hungry for drama and eager to judge. The Ton's reaction to Edmund's betrayal was predictably vicious and self-serving, with aristocratic families who had smiled at the Thornfields for generations now whispering that perhaps there was something cursed about the duchy, something tainted in the bloodline that produced traitors and mysterious deaths. Sebastian's peers began distancing themselves, declining his invitations, crossing to the other side of the street when they saw him approach, not out of any real moral conviction, but out of fear that association with scandal might contaminate their own reputations. Into this atmosphere of social isolation came Lady Cordelia Ashworth, a widow of impeccable lineage and considerable beauty who had been pursuing Sebastian for months with the single-minded determination of a woman who knew her value in the marriage market and intended to claim the prize she deserved. Lady Cordelia arrived at Ashmont House uninvited, sweeping past the butler with the confidence of someone who believed herself above the normal rules of courtesy, and she made her intentions clear with a brutal efficiency that left Isabel feeling as though she had been physically struck. The Duke needed a wife who could restore his reputation, who could provide him with legitimate heirs and political connections, and Lady Cordelia was prepared to overlook his recent unpleasantness with his cousin if Sebastian would simply acknowledge the reality of his position and propose the marriage that society expected. Isabel had been descending the main staircase with Catherine when Lady Cordelia made her declaration in the entrance hall, her voice pitched to carry, and the little girl's hand had tightened in hers as they both froze on the landing, unwilling witnesses to a conversation that felt like a door slamming shut on every fragile dream Isabel had allowed herself to imagine. Sebastian's response had been cold and immediate, telling Lady Cordelia that he had no intention of marrying for political convenience or social approval, that his heart was already engaged elsewhere, and that she should leave his house and not return. But Lady Cordelia had laughed, a brittle sound full of contempt and confidence, and she had said the words that would haunt Isabel for days afterward. That whatever infatuation Sebastian might be harboring for some inappropriate woman would fade when he truly understood what it meant to be cut off from his own class, to watch his niece grow up without the social connections she needed, to see his family's ancient name become a source of mocker, rather than respect, and that when he came to his senses, Lady Cordelia would be waiting, ready to provide the respectability and legitimacy he would inevitably realize he needed. The widow's words planted seeds of doubt that grew like poison vines through Isabel's thoughts, wrapping around every moment of happiness she tried to claim with Sebastian, choking the fragile hope that had been taking root in her carefully guarded heart. She began pulling away, making excuses to avoid their evening conversations, keeping her interactions with the Duke brief and formal, retreating back into the role of invisible governess even as Sebastian pursued her with increasing desperation through the corridors of his own house. Isabel told herself she was being sensible, protecting both of them from a future of regret and social ruin, but the truth she could not quite admit was that Lady Cordelia's contemptuous certainty had awakened the old fear that lived at Isabel's core, the belief that had been carved into her soul by years of poverty and loss, that women like her did not get fairy tale endings, that love was a luxury reserved for those with the proper names and faces and fortunes, and that reaching for more than she deserved would only result in pain for everyone she dared to care about. Catherine, with the uncanny perception of children who have learned to read the emotional currents of the adults around them, sensed the growing distance between her uncle and her beloved governess and became increasingly distressed, asking Isabel repeatedly if she had done something wrong, if Miss Hartley was going to leave like all the other governesses, if Uncle Sebastian was going to become cold and sad again the way he had been before. Each question broke another piece of Isabel's heart, for she had not realized how completely she had woven herself into this small family's life, how much Catherine had come to depend on her presence, how much her own happiness had become entangled with the happiness of these two people, who had somehow transformed from employer and student into the family she thought she would never have again. But knowing she was hurting them by pulling away did not make Isabel strong enough to stop, did not give her the courage to believe that Sebastian's love could survive the reality of what choosing her would cost him, and so she continued her retreat, building walls around her heart even as those walls crumbled a little more, with every wounded look Sebastian gave her, with every plea from Catherine to please not be sad anymore, with every long night she spent alone in her room, wondering if running away from love to protect it was wisdom or simply the cowardice of a woman too broken to believe she deserved to be chosen. Sebastian Thornfield was not a man accustomed to being denied what he wanted, and what he wanted with an intensity that bordered on obsession was Isabel Hartley, not hidden away in the servants' quarters or relegated to the shadows of his household, but standing openly beside him as his equal and his choice. He understood her fears because they mirrored his own doubts, the voices of duty and propriety that had been drilled into him since birth. But he also understood something Isabel had not yet grasped, that a life lived in fear of judgment was not really a life at all, but merely an existence, and he had spent 2 years existing in the cold prison of propriety, and it had nearly destroyed him. So Sebastian made a decision that would either vindicate his faith in their love or expose him as the fool Lady Cordelia believed him to be. He would force London society to see Isabel not as a governess or a woman without connections, but as the extraordinary person she truly was, and he would do it at the place where reputation was made and destroyed, where the ton gathered to judge and be judged, where a single public gesture could echo through drawing rooms for an entire season. The Ashworth Ball, the grandest social event of the winter, hosted ironically by Lady Cordelia's own family, an event that every member of the aristocracy would attend, and where Sebastian's attendance had been assumed despite his recent troubles. The invitation had arrived at Ashmont House 2 weeks after Lady Cordelia's unwelcome visit, an elaborately embossed card that was both a social obligation and a test, for everyone knew that if the Duke of Ashmont declined to appear at such an important event, it would signal his complete retreat from society, a tacit admission that the scandal of Edmund's betrayal had broken him. Sebastian had no intention of giving the gossips that satisfaction, but more importantly, he had no intention of going alone. He sought out Isabel in the nursery on a grey December afternoon, finding her teaching Catherine to sketch, and he presented her with a request that was really a demand wrapped in the language of choice, that she accompany him to the ball as his partner, not hidden as a governess, but introduced openly as the woman he intended to marry, the woman who had saved his life and claimed his heart. Isabel had stared at him as though he had lost his mind, her face draining of colour, as she understood exactly what he was proposing, the social suicide of appearing at a formal ball with a woman of no rank or family, the deliberate provocation of presenting her to the very people who would judge her most harshly, the permanent severing of any possibility of reconciliation with the world he had been born to inhabit. She had refused, of course, her voice shaking as she told him she could not, would not be the instrument of his destruction, that attending such an event would expose her to the mockery and contempt of hundreds of people who would see her as nothing more than an ambitious servant trying to trap a duke, and that the humiliation would be unbearable not just for her, but for Catherine, who would have to watch her governess become the subject of cruel gossip and vicious speculation. Sebastian had listened patiently, and then he had done something that shocked both Isabel and young Catherine, who was supposedly focused on her drawing, but was actually absorbing every word of their conversation with wide, anxious eyes. He had taken Isabel's hand, gone down on one knee right there in the nursery surrounded by children's books and watercolor paints, and he had asked her properly, formally, to marry him, producing a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a square-cut emerald surrounded by diamonds that caught the winter light and seemed to hold all the green promise of spring within its depths. The proposal was not a surprise, for Sebastian had already declared his intentions during that stormy night in her room. But the ring, the kneeling, the formal asking in front of Catherine, as though Isabel's answer truly mattered and was not simply a foregone conclusion, broke through the wall she had been desperately trying to rebuild around her heart. She looked at this powerful man kneeling before her, this duke who could have any woman in England with a word, and she saw not his title or his wealth or his social position, but simply Sebastian, the man who had been broken by loss, just as she had been, who understood what it meant to survive when the world wanted you dead, who looked at her not as a governess or a woman without worth, but as the person he wanted beside him for every day of his remaining life. Isabel felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she whispered yes, as she let him slip the emerald onto her finger where it hung loose and heavy and impossibly beautiful, as Catherine shrieked with joy and threw herself into their embrace, chattering about how she had known. She had absolutely known that Uncle Sebastian loved Miss Hartley, and that now they would be a proper family, and she would never have to worry about losing anyone ever again. But agreeing to marry Sebastian in the private sanctuary of the nursery was a vastly different matter from agreeing to face London society at the Ashworth ball, and as the date approached, Isabel's terror grew in proportion to Sebastian's calm determination. He refused to let her retreat, refused to accept her arguments about the scandal they would cause, and he enlisted unexpected allies in his campaign to convince her. Mrs. Crawford, who had initially warned Isabel about overstepping, but who now grudgingly admitted that she had never seen the Duke truly happy until Miss Hartley entered his life, and the Dowager Duchess herself, Sebastian's formidable aunt, who arrived at Ashmont House in a flurry of expensive furs and aristocratic authority, and announced that if her nephew had finally found a woman worth loving, then society could damn well adjust its narrow litty. Mind to accept her. The Dowager's support came with practical assistance, for she brought with her a modiste and a small army of servants who descended upon Isabel like a benevolent invasion, measuring and pinning and transforming her from invisible governess into something that made her catch her breath when she finally saw herself in the mirror, a woman who looked like she might possibly belong in a duke's world after all. The night of the Ashworth ball arrived with a clarity that felt almost cruel, a cold December evening where every star seemed to shine with judgment, and the moon hung full and bright over London like a spotlight waiting to expose all secrets. Isabel stood in her room at Ashmont House, staring at her reflection in the long mirror and barely recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The modiste had created a gown of deep sapphire silk that transformed her unremarkable figure into something elegant and striking. The bodice fitted perfectly to emphasize a waist she had not known she possessed, the skirts falling in layers of shimmering fabric that caught the candlelight with every movement, and her dark hair had been dressed in an elaborate style that framed her face and made her hazel eyes seem larger, more luminous, almost beautiful. The emerald engagement ring glowed on her finger like a promise or a threat, and Isabel felt her stomach twist with nausea as she imagined walking into that ballroom, imagined the moment when hundreds of aristocratic eyes would turn toward her and see not a duchess-to-be but an impostor, a servant pretending to be something she could never truly become. Every instinct she had developed during her years of survival screamed at her to run, to disappear into the night before she could be exposed and humiliated, but she had given her word to Sebastian, and more importantly, she had given her heart, and breaking either of those promises would destroy something in herself that she was not sure she could survive losing. Sebastian came to collect her himself, rather than sending a servant, and when he saw her in the gown, Isabel watched his dark eyes widen with an expression that was hunger and wonder and fierce possessive pride all tangled together. He looked magnificent in his formal evening clothes, every inch the powerful duke, and yet when he took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above his grandmother's ring, the gesture was so tender that Isabel felt fresh tears threatening to ruin the careful work the lady's maid had done on her face. Sebastian told her she was beautiful, that she was brave, that he would be beside her every moment of the evening, and that no one, absolutely no one, would be permitted to speak to her with anything less than the respect she deserved as his chosen bride. His confidence should have been reassuring, but Isabel knew what he did not seem to understand, that the ton did not operate on fairness or logic, that reputation was currency and scandal was poison, and that by choosing to marry her, Sebastian was essentially declaring war on the very society he had been born to lead, a war that neither of them could truly win, no matter how much they loved each other. The journey to Ashworth House felt simultaneously endless and far too short, the carriage rolling through London's streets, while Isabel sat rigid with tension, and Sebastian held her hand as though he could transfer his certainty into her trembling body through simple touch. They could hear the ball before they saw it, the sound of music and laughter spilling from the brightly lit mansion, and as their carriage joined the long line of vehicles depositing London's elite at the entrance, Isabel caught glimpses of the glittering crowd inside, women in jewels that cost more than her father's entire fortune, men whose family names appeared in history books, the cream of English society gathered to see and be seen and tea. How judge anyone who dared to step outside the invisible lines that governed their world? When their carriage finally reached the entrance and a footman opened the door, Sebastian descended first and then turned to offer Isabel his hand, and she realized with a jolt of pure terror that this was the moment of no return. That once she stepped out of this carriage on the Duke of Ashmont's arm, there would be no going back to invisibility, no retreating to the safety of obscurity, no pretending she was just a governess who could fade into the background when the scrutiny became too intense. She took his hand anyway, because love, she was discovering, made you brave even when bravery felt indistinguishable from madness, and she let Sebastian guide her out of the carriage and up the steps into the entrance hall of Ashworth House, where a servant in elaborate livery stood ready to announce the arriving guests. Isabel felt every eye in the entrance hall turned toward them, felt the sudden hush that fell over the crowd as people recognized the Duke of Ashmont and began trying to identify the unknown woman on his arm, the woman who was clearly not a member of their world, but who wore that extraordinary ring and stood beside the Duke, with a familiarity that suggested shocking intimacy. She heard the whispers beginning, waves of speculation and scandal rippling through the assembled aristocrats like wind through wheat, and her grip on Sebastian's arm tightened until her knuckles went white, every muscle in her body preparing for flight or fight, the old survival instinct screaming at her to protect herself from the danger she could feel gathering in the air like an approaching storm. Sebastian must have sensed her terror, because he covered her hand with his own, turning to look at her with such fierce devotion that for a moment the crowded entrance hall seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them suspended in a bubble of shared certainty. He told her quietly, for her ears alone, that she was not facing this alone, that he was hers as completely as she was his, and that whatever happened in the next hours, they would face it together as partners and equals, Duke and Duchess in everything but the final formality of the ceremony. Then he turned back to the servant who stood waiting to announce them, and Isabel heard Sebastian give the instruction that would change both their lives forever. He told the man to announce not the Duke of Ashmont and guest, but the Duke of Ashmont and his intended bride, Miss Isabel Hartley, and to ensure that everyone in the ballroom heard every single word, because Sebastian wanted there to be no confusion, no possibility of misunderstanding about exactly who this woman was and what she meant to him. The ballroom of Ashworth House was a cathedral of wealth and privilege, all soaring ceilings painted with classical scenes, crystal chandeliers that transformed candlelight into cascading diamonds, and polished floors that reflected the jeweled splendor of England's most elite families. The orchestra was playing a waltz when the servant's voice rang out across the room with formal precision, announcing the Duke of Ashmont and his intended bride, Miss Isabel Hartley, and the music died mid-phrase as though someone had severed the conductor's hands, leaving only shocked silence and the sound of Isabel's heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the ballroom could hear it. She felt hundreds of eyes fix upon her with the weight of physical touch, felt the collective intake of breath as the tongue processed what they had just heard, and then the whispers exploded like a powder keg igniting, voices rising in waves of disbelief and outrage and scandalized delight as London society confronted the impossible reality of a duke claiming a nobody as his bride. Isabel wanted to turn and run, wanted to disappear through the floor, but Sebastian's arm was solid as iron beneath her hand, and he began walking forward into that sea of judgment with his head high and his expression daring anyone to question his choice, pulling her with him into the heart of the ballroom where the crowd parted before them, like water before the prow of a ship, creating a pathway of empty space that felt more like a gauntlet than a welcome. Lady Cordelia Ashworth stood near the center of the room in a gown of cream silk and diamonds, and the expression on her beautiful face was a masterpiece of aristocratic contempt as she watched Sebastian approach with the governess on his arm. She did not bother to lower her voice when she spoke to the women clustered around her, remarking loudly that the Duke must have taken leave of his senses, that grief and isolation had clearly damaged his judgment, and that someone of proper breeding and concern for his welfare really ought to intervene before he completed this catastrophic mistake and married a woman whose only accomplishment was apparently throwing knives at dinner parties. The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded, each syllable landing like a physical blow against Isabel's carefully maintained composure. But before she could respond or retreat, Sebastian did something that silenced the entire ballroom more effectively than any announcement. He stopped walking, turned to face Lady Cordelia directly, and addressed her with a voice that carried to every corner of the vast room, cold and precise and absolute, hugely devastating in its aristocratic authority. Sebastian thanked Lady Cordelia for her concern, but assured her that his judgment had never been clearer, that Miss Hartley's accomplishments extended far beyond her courage in defending his life, and included intelligence, compassion, integrity, and a strength of character that made her more worthy of his name and his title than any woman of his acquaintance, regardless of their birth or fortune. He continued, his voice growing warmer as he spoke not just to Lady Cordelia, but to the entire assembled company, telling them that Isabel had saved not merely his physical life, but something far more important, his capacity to feel, to trust, to believe that there were still people in this world who acted from genuine goodness, rather than calculation or greed. He spoke of how she had transformed his broken niece into a happy child, how she had faced down an assassin without hesitation, how she possessed more natural nobility in her compassion for others than most titled ladies demonstrated in their entire privileged lives, and he concluded by stating clearly and unequivocally that if London society could not accept his choice of bride, then London society was welcome to exclude him from their ballroom, and their dinner parties, because he would rather spend his life with Isabel in isolation than waste another moment pretending to respect the opinions of people whose judgment was based on nothing more substantial than the accident of their birth. The silence that followed Sebastian's declaration was absolute and suffocating, broken only when the Dowager Duchess, who had been watching from the side of the room with her sharp, intelligent eyes, began to clap, the sound of her gloved hands coming together slow and deliberate and impossible to ignore. She walked forward through the frozen crowd, her considerable presence and impeccable lineage giving her a authority that even Lady Cordelia could not dismiss, and she announced in a voice trained by decades of commanding society's attention that her nephew had made an excellent choice, that Miss Hartley was clearly a woman of exceptional quality, and that the Dowager herself looked forward to welcoming her as the new Duchess of Ashmont. The endorsement from such a respected matriarch broke the paralysis that had gripped the ballroom, and slowly, reluctantly, other members of the ton began to follow her lead, some out of genuine respect for the Dowager's judgment, others out of fear of being on the wrong side of a powerful family, but all of them understanding that the Duke of Ashmont had just drawn a line in the social sand and forced them to choose which side they would stand on. But not everyone was willing to accept Sebastian's declaration or defer to the Dowager's authority, and as the orchestra hesitantly began playing again and couples returned to the dance floor, Lady Cordelia made one final attempt to destroy what she could not possess. She approached Isabel directly, while Sebastian was momentarily distracted by a conversation with his aunt, and she spoke in a voice pitched low enough for privacy but sharp enough to cut bone, telling Isabel that wearing a fine gown and an expensive ring did not transform a servant into a duchess, that everyone in this room knew exactly what she was and where she came from, and that the Duke's infatuation would fade the moment he realized that love could not bridge the unbridgeable gap between their worlds. She suggested with poisonous sweetness that if Isabel truly cared for Sebastian, if she genuinely wanted what was best for him, rather than simply wanting to escape her own poverty and obscurity, then she would do the honorable thing and release him from his rash promise before she dragged him down into social ruin and destroyed everything his family had built over centuries of careful cultivation of power and prestige. Lady Cordelia's words struck at the deepest wound in Isabel's heart, the fear that had haunted her since the moment Sebastian first declared his love, the terrible suspicion that accepting his proposal was not courage, but selfishness, that she was choosing her own happiness over his welfare and condemning him to a life of social isolation and diminished influence. For a moment, standing in that glittering ballroom surrounded by hostile faces and contemptuous whispers, Isabel felt the old darkness rising inside her, the voice that told her she was not worthy, could never be worthy, that women like her did not deserve fairy tale endings, and reaching for them only brought pain to everyone she loved. She looked at Lady Cordelia's beautiful, certain face, and saw reflected there all the doubts that kept her awake at night, all the reasons why this could never work, all the evidence that she was making a catastrophic mistake that would hurt Sebastian far more than it would ever heal him. But then something shifted inside Isabel, some fundamental change in the way she saw herself and her story, and instead of retreating into silence and shame as she had done her entire life, she felt anger kindle in her chest, bright and hot and clarifying, anger not at Lady Cordelia, but at the entire system of arbitrary value that decided human worth based on birth and fortune rather than character and action. Isabel straightened her spine, lifted her chin and met Lady Cordelia's gaze with an intensity that made the other woman actually step back in surprise. She spoke quietly, but with a conviction that came from every hard lesson she had learned in her 25 years of surviving in a world that wanted to make her invisible, telling Lady Cordelia that she understood exactly what the aristocracy thought of her, that she had never been under any illusions about her place in their hierarchy, but that she also understood something Lady Cordelia apparently did not, that Sebastian was not a prize to be, one or a title to be claimed, but a man who deserved to make his own choices about his own life, and that his choice to love her was not evidence of temporary madness, but a testament to his ability to see value where others saw only absence of pedigree. Isabel continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, saying that she had not pursued Sebastian, had not schemed or manipulated or tried to trap him, that she had actually resisted his declarations and tried to protect him from exactly the kind of judgment Lady Cordelia was now demonstrating, but that Sebastian had insisted, had chosen her repeatedly despite all her arguments against it, and that calling his love for her an infatuation way, fair not merely insulting to Isabel, but deeply disrespectful to Sebastian himself, suggesting that he lacked the intelligence or maturity to understand his own heart. The confrontation had drawn attention from the guests nearby, creating a small circle of observers who pretended not to be listening while hanging on every word, and Isabel realized with a strange sense of liberation that she no longer cared who heard her or what they thought of her boldness. She told Lady Cordelia that if the price of loving Sebastian was enduring the contempt of people who valued names over character, then she would pay that price gladly, because what she and Sebastian had found together was worth more than all the social approval in England, and that she would not release him from his promise, because doing so would break both their hearts and condemn them both to lives of lonely propriety when they could have had something real and true and transformative. She finished by saying something that shocked even herself with its audacity, that perhaps Lady Cordelia's real anger was not that the Duke had chosen unwisely, but that he had chosen someone who loved him for himself rather than for his title, and that such genuine affection was apparently so foreign to Lady Cordelia's experience that she could not recognize it when she saw it, which was truly the saddest commentary on the state of aristocratic marriage that Isabel could imagine. Lady Cordelia's face flushed with fury and humiliation at having been challenged so directly by someone she considered beneath her notice, and she opened her mouth to deliver what was surely intended to be a devastating retort. But before she could speak, Sebastian was suddenly there, materializing at Isabel's side with an expression of such fierce pride and possessive satisfaction that several people in the watching crowd actually gasped. He had heard at least part of the exchange, and instead of being embarrassed by Isabel's boldness or concerned about how her confrontation with Lady Cordelia would play in tomorrow's gossip, He looked at her as though she had just done something magnificent and heroic, as though speaking her truth in defiance of social pressure was exactly the kind of courage he valued most. He took Isabel's hand, raised it to his lips again in a gesture that was becoming their private ritual, and then he turned to the assembled crowd, to all the aristocrats who had been watching their drama unfold with varying degrees of shock and scandal and secret delight, and he asked Isabel a question that transformed the Ashworth Ball from a social event into a moment that would be remembered and recounted in London drawing rooms for years to come. Sebastian asked Isabel clearly and publicly, so that everyone in the ballroom could hear, if she would do him the honor of dancing the next waltz with him, and the question was so simple, so seemingly ordinary, except that everyone present understood its true significance. A duke did not dance with a governess, did not claim her publicly on a ballroom floor, did not make such a visible declaration of intimacy and intention unless he was absolute, telly certain of his choice, and completely unconcerned with social consequences. Isabel felt tears gathering in her eyes as she understood what Sebastian was offering her, not just a dance, but a public claiming, a visible demonstration that she belonged to him and he to her, and that their connection was not something shameful to be hidden, but something precious to be celebrated. She whispered yes, barely able to speak past the emotion clogging her throat, and Sebastian led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra began playing. And as he took her in his arms and they began to move together in perfect synchronization, Isabel felt the last of her doubts dissolve, replaced by a certainty that matched Sebastian's own, that whatever challenges they would face, whatever gossip and judgment and social exclusion might come, they would face it together, and their love would be stronger for having been tested in the fire of public scrutiny and choosing to survive. The waltz became a turning point, not just for Isabel and Sebastian, but for the entire ballroom, as other couples gradually joined them on the floor, and the rigid hostility that had greeted their arrival began to soften into something more complex and uncertain. Some members of the ton remained determinedly disapproving, turning their backs and whispering behind fans, but others, particularly the younger generation and those who had themselves felt constrained by society's arbitrary rules, watched the Duke and his chosen bride with something approaching admiration, recognizing in their defiance a courage that most people only dreamed of possessing. The Dowager Duchess used her considerable influence to ensure that the evening progressed smoothly, steering conversations away from scandal and toward acceptance, and by the time supper was announced, several brave souls had actually approached Isabel to introduce themselves properly, and while their courtesy was perhaps more motivated by fear of offending the Duke than genuine warmth toward his bride, it was nevertheless a beginning, a crack, in the wall of aristocratic resistance that suggested the possibility of eventual acceptance. Sebastian never left Isabel's side throughout the entire evening, his hand constantly at the small of her back or holding hers, his presence a shield and a declaration, and Isabel drew strength from his unwavering certainty, learning in those long hours at the Ashworth Ball that sometimes love required not just private devotion, but public courage, the willingness to stand together against judgment and choose each other even when the easier path would be to surrender to social pressure. They left the ball near midnight, and as their carriage rolled through London's dark streets toward Ashmont House, Isabel felt exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure, emotionally wrung out from hours of maintaining her composure under intense scrutiny, but also strangely triumphant, as though she had survived a battle and emerged not unscathed, but certainly unbowed. Sebastian held her against his side, his arm around her shoulders, and he told her that she had been magnificent, that her confrontation with Lady Cordelia had been the moment when he knew with absolute certainty that she was strong enough to be his duchess, that she possessed not just the courage to face danger, but the even rarer courage to claim her own worth in the face of people determined to deny it. They were married 3 weeks later, in a quiet ceremony at Ashmont House, with only the Dowager Duchess Catherine and a handful of Sebastian's most loyal friends in attendance, and if London society gossiped endlessly about the scandalous match, neither the Duke nor his new Duchess paid the whispers any attention, too absorbed in building their life together to care what narrow-minded people thought of their happiness. The months that followed brought both challenges and unexpected joys, as Isabel navigated the complex role of Duchess of Ashmont and gradually won over even some of her harshest critics through her genuine kindness, her evident devotion to Catherine, and her quiet refusal to be diminished by social slights or whispered insults. Sebastian's love never wavered, never showed the regret or resentment that Isabel had secretly feared might appear once the initial passion faded, and instead it deepened into something even more precious. A partnership built on mutual respect and understanding, on shared values and complementary strengths, on the knowledge that they had both been broken by their pasts and had chosen to heal together rather than suffer alone. Catherine blossomed under their combined care, growing from a sad, withdrawn child into a confident young girl who understood that family was not defined by blood or social standing, but by love and loyalty and the willingness to fight for each other when the world tried to tear you apart. Within 2 years, Isabel gave birth to a son, the heir to the Ashmont dukedom, and the Tun was forced to acknowledge that this union they had deemed impossible had produced exactly what aristocratic marriages were supposed to provide: continuity, stability, and the promise of a future generation. But perhaps the most profound transformation was internal. The way Isabel gradually learned to see herself through Sebastian's eyes, rather than through society's judgment, to recognize her own worth not as something contingent on external validation, but as an inherent truth that existed independent of title or fortune or social approval. She established programs to help young women in circumstances similar to her own past, providing education and employment to those whom society had deemed worthless. And she did this work not in secret or with apologetic diffidence, but openly, using her position as Duchess to force the aristocracy to acknowledge the humanity and potential of people they preferred to ignore. Sebastian supported every initiative, proud of the way his wife used her power for good, and together they created a household that valued character over pedigree, kindness over status, and genuine connection over social performance. The whispers about the Duke's scandalous marriage eventually faded, replaced by grudging respect for a couple whose love had survived every test society could devise, and whose partnership demonstrated that sometimes the greatest courage was not in following convention, but in choosing to write your own story according to your own values. Years later, when Isabel was firmly established as one of London's most respected duchesses, known for her charitable works and her happy marriage rather than for her humble origins, she would sometimes think back to that night at the Ashworth Ball, to the moment when she had stood in that glittering ballroom and chosen to claim her worth rather than accept society's diminishment. And she would feel grateful not just for Sebastian's love, but or her own courage in accepting it. She had learned that vindication was not about proving others wrong, but about proving yourself right, about recognizing your own value so clearly that external judgment lost its power to wound or diminish. Her story was not a fairy tale where a prince rescued a helpless maiden, but something far more powerful, a true partnership where two broken people had chosen to heal together, where a woman without status had claimed her right to love and be loved, and where courage and character had triumphed over the arbitrary hierarchies that tried to keep people in their assigned places. And so, dear listener, if you find yourself doubting your own worth, if society's judgments make you feel small or invisible or undeserving of the love and happiness you dream of claiming, remember Isabel Hartley, who began as a governess that no one noticed and became a duchess whom no one could ignore, not through manipulation or compromise, but through the simple, radical act of believing she deserved more than the limited role the world had assigned her. Remember that your value is not determined by your birth or your bank account or the opinions of people too narrow-minded to see past superficial markers of status. Remember that true nobility lies in character, in courage, in the willingness to stand up for what you believe even when everyone around you says you are wrong or foolish or reaching too high. And remember that the greatest love stories are not those where everything comes easily, but those where two people choose each other despite every obstacle, every judgment, every voice that tells them their love is impossible, because they understand that some connections are worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect, worth building an entire life around, even if that life looks nothing like the one society expected them to live. Your story is not finished, and the courage you need to write your own ending, to claim your own worth, to demand the love and respect you deserve, already lives inside you, waiting for the moment when you are brave enough to let it shine.